The execution of Alexei Navalny, I use the word execution advisedly, it's obviously provoked outrage across the globe. Lord Cameron's called for more sanctions. Do you think that's right? And if so, what might they be?
Well, may I start by saying that Alexei Navalny was one of the fiercest advocates for democracy in Russia, a fierce critic of Putin, a courageous man. Any of us who are politicians in the West know the challenges that there are standing for election. But then imagine trying to do that in Russia and standing against Putin. His courage and his courageousness knows no bounds, knew no bounds. You're right to phrase it in the way that you did. The Foreign Secretary has been very firm and robust in his condemnation and blame, frankly, of Putin for what happened. You mentioned sanctions. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've sanctioned 1,700 individuals and entities as well, and it's right that the Foreign Secretary considers the appropriate next steps.
I noticed that you picked up the word that I used, execution. You are clear that this is something that happened at the behest of the Kremlin.
It's very clear, as the Foreign Secretary said, to lay the blame at the door of Putin. As I said, Alexei Navalny was a courageous politician. All of us who stand for politics in the West know how hard and how challenging that is. But imagine how challenging that is to try and stand up to Putin. The Foreign Secretary, in my view, is absolutely correct to lay the blame firmly at Putin's door.
Well, what are we going to do about it? What are we able to do that we are not already doing in terms of sanctions, punishment of Putin himself? What would we actually do?
Well, in terms of what we are already doing, there's sanctions that the Foreign Secretary has spoken about. I told you...
I mean, what more could we do? That doesn't seem to have had any discouraging effect on Putin thus far.
Well, in terms of what has happened, this is robust action. Sanctioning 1,700 individuals and entities is robust action that we have taken. The Foreign Secretary has said that he will look to see what more can be done. And don't forget what we're doing in Ukraine and to support Ukraine as well. It's incredibly important. The $2.5 billion that we're putting towards the effort in Ukraine, we're encouraging our allies, our NATO allies, to ensure that they spend their 2% early to make sure that we support what is going on in Ukraine. This is positive action that we are taking to stand up to Putin. Let's
come to Ukraine, if we may.
Of course.
The leader of the opposition, Mr. Starmer, yesterday said in Munich that the fault here lay directly with Mr. Trump for discouraging, essentially, his followers in Congress from, or indirectly, from passing the £60 billion worth of $60 billion worth of aid, military aid, to Ukraine. Would you agree that Mr. Trump has some responsibility here? And would you support the criticism that Sir Keir Starmer's made?
No, listen, it's up to our US friends and allies. They've got to go through their own process and processes. And of course, it's right that we encourage all our NATO allies to play their part. But I'm not sitting here seeking to criticise. I'm seeking to encourage our international friends and allies to play their part as we are doing. You have seen that we have been front and centre. The Prime Minister and the United Kingdom have been front and centre of our support in Ukraine.
Mr. Zelensky was pretty clear in Munich that this was the big issue. That $60 billion package would make the difference. And, of course, they've lost a frontline city to the Russians over this weekend. Let me ask you again, what can we do to dislodge that package?
Listen, that's a matter for the United States. They've got to go through their processes. What we can do is encourage our friends and international allies. We can also lead by example, and that's what we have been doing since the outset. And the Prime Minister has led by example, as has the Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary. I've mentioned £2.5 billion that we are doing. That's part of the package that we are doing in terms of supporting Ukraine. You've also seen what we're doing in terms of supporting Ukrainian refugees, and you may have seen overnight the visa extension scheme that there is, again, showing our support for President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine. These are practical steps that the government is taking and the Prime Minister is taking in support of Ukraine.
All right, let's talk about the events in politics this week. You took a beating, really, in the two by-elections in Kingswood and Wellingborough. Perhaps the most telling outcome of those contests was the record-level vote for the Reform Party, which basically has only one policy: stop immigration. You are the Minister for Immigration. Isn't this concrete evidence that the voters think that you're failing?
Well, let me deal with the by-elections first of all and then come on to immigration. In terms of the by-elections, you're right, they're a very difficult set of circumstances, the elections, and you're right about reform. What people saw is if you vote for reform, you get Labour and you go back to square one. On immigration, we've seen actually progress that we've been making. Last year, small boat crossings down by a third, 16,000 fewer people making that crossing. I was over in France 48 hours ago speaking to our French allies and counterparts and seeing on the ground the work that they are doing to stop the boats. I was there when a boat was seized from a car, stopping and preventing yet another crossing. We must strain every sinew. The Prime Minister has charged me with the task and the job of stopping the boats, and that's what I'm getting on with doing.
Can I just ask you one thing? On this show, we try to avoid political code. What is square one? When you say we go back to square one, what is that?
Well, in my view, it's even worse than square one, because Keir Starmer's been voting against the very legislation that we've been bringing in. Let me give you a concrete example.
Sorry, what?
Well, let me tell you, in terms, the Nationalities and Borders Act that we brought in that enables us to prosecute those who are trafficking, the human smugglers, those who are pursuing this vile trade. We are now prosecuting them in their hundreds, and they're being sentenced to hundreds of hours imprisonment thanks to the measures that we brought in that were, in fact, blocked, that were attempted to be blocked. They were voted against by Labour. So that's what I mean by going back to square one. Every single measure that we have brought in has been opposed by Labour. That's what I mean by going back to square one.
If I may say so, though, the problem is, whichever square it is, the voters blame you for where we are right now. You've been in power for 14 years, and they were pretty clear in these two by-elections. Half of those who didn't vote for you, who'd previously voted for the Tories in 2019, voted for Labour, but the other half voted for reform. Now, maybe the first half want to go back to this square one that you talk about, but the other half want something different, something tougher on immigration. Which half are you going to respond to?
Well, in terms of my portfolio, in terms of immigration and the measures that we are taking and introducing the most robust illegal migration legislation that's ever been put before Parliament. This is a concrete evidence of what we're doing.
Yeah,
Trevor, you'll see tomorrow that the Rwanda bill is back in Parliament. It was actually during recess. It was in the House of Lords for 2 days. It's back in Parliament tomorrow. It's got another committee day that it's going through, and we're making sure that we can bring in the Rwanda plan so that the flights can take off. That is my job. That is my responsibility.
So to take your gaming analogy, you're putting all your chips on the Rwanda square, are you? Now, many of your former colleagues in the anti-Brexit European Research Group think that actually that isn't enough. And in fact, what you're doing on Rwanda isn't enough. They think you've gone soft and that you won't take on the EU and that you're just standing by while record numbers come into the country, both legally and illegally. Isn't the problem here that you're just falling between two stools? You're not satisfying those who think that your policy on Rwanda is wrong and cruel, and you're not satisfying those who think that you really need to be tougher.
Well, let me just put that into a bit of context. I disagree with the first part of your question. That's not right. Rwanda is one part of a bigger scheme. I mentioned that 48 hours ago I was in France talking to our French partners and allies and seeing what they are doing. Also, there's the work we're doing further upstream in terms of smashing the gangs as well. But let me talk about the ERG. I was a member of the ERG. I know and understand their concerns. Their concerns are my concerns. And that's why we're bringing forward this legislation. It's not about it's just this one scheme. But Rwanda is a very important part. It's part of the deterrent effect. And when we see those planes taking off, that's when the deterrent effect will kick in, just as it did with Albania.
No planes have taken off. There have been more Home Secretaries shipped to Rwanda than there have been asylum seekers, because the latter number is precisely 0.
Well, that's why the bill is being brought through. That's why the treaty was signed by the Home Secretary on the 5th of December. And as soon as the treaty is ratified and the bill is through Parliament, it's got to go through all of its stages, of course. I mentioned the House of Lords.
OK.
It's got to come back and there's got to be ping-pong. And when that happens, then the planes will take off.
Can we get a clear answer then? You are guaranteeing that there will be planes to Rwanda, they will carry asylum seekers, and they will discourage people from coming across the channel. You're guaranteeing that before the next election?
Yes, we need to get through the bill first. Yes, we need to get the treaty ratified, and then the planes will take off. I want that to happen as soon as possible. You can sense, I hope, my impatience for that. That must happen as soon as possible.
Oh, great. Well, I think the voters will hear that guarantee. More broadly, it's been a pretty dreadful week for Mr Sunak. On Monday, you had Labour on the back foot because of the anti-Semitism row. By Friday, you're having to defend dismal economic numbers and recessions. Some of your colleagues are saying this weekend that it's time to drop the pilot, get rid of Mr Sunak. Now, I don't expect you to agree with that. What will you say to those people? What is your message to those, let's call it on the right of your party, who are saying it's time to get rid of the Prime Minister?
Well, actually, I don't recognise that. There aren't a large number of people, as you suggest.
I can tell you, I've been saying it to Sky reporters all week. So what do you say it to them? What do you say to them?
In terms of, you mentioned this in the context of the economy, we've got to look at where we started when the Prime Minister became Prime Minister. The inflation was at 11.1%. It's now down to 4%. That was his top priority, was to halve inflation. That is the plan. The plan is beginning to work. You're right. Of course, it's been a challenging set of economic circumstances. Just look at the international backdrop that we've been talking about. Look at COVID that we've been through as well. But despite that, we've ensured that we've got inflation down from 11.1% to 4%. I speak to my Trevor. I speak to my colleagues all the time. I speak to them whether they're on the right, whether they're in the centre. We're all part of the same party, and it's by evidence. It's by evidencing the progress that we have made and that we are continuing to make.
If I may say so, can we actually look at the evidence? You probably can't see it, but I'm going to show a chart here which shows per capita economic growth over the past 7 quarters, all negative. Every person in this country, on average, has been getting poorer. What's great about that?
The single biggest block to economic growth is inflation. And as I've said, we've seen inflation falling.
No, but you've just been telling me that this is a kind of improving picture. Just deal with the 7 quarters of negative economic growth per capita.
In terms of growth, the single biggest block to economic growth is inflation. Inflation is falling in line with our plan. And actually, if you look at forecasts, if you look at the IMF, if you look at the OBR, the OECD, if you look at the Bank of England, all forecasting growth, and the IMF forecasting that we'll grow faster than France, faster than Germany, Italy and Japan. Trevor, let me tell you this as well. What single biggest thing can we do? We can do tax cuts for businesses. The 11 billion package that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor delivered, that will increase jobs and increase growth as well.
Oh, more tax cuts coming?
Well, that's a matter for the Chancellor. That's not a matter for me. There'll be a budget, and you'll see that on the 6th of March, and that's a matter for him.
You'd be happy to see that, would you?
Yes, of course I would. All Conservatives would. As I said, a tax cut for businesses means encouraging growth and encouraging prosperity for our country.
Just very quickly, Mr Tomlinson, just very last quick question. You've just done this. Mr Sunak also has called on the right to unite. The Conservative family called it. In the past few by-elections, if you combined the Conservative and Reform votes, actually, you could have beaten Labour. Why aren't you talking to Mr Farage and Mr Tice, the leaders of Reform, about a deal?
Trevor, my message is very simple, and you saw it in the by-elections this week. A vote for reform is a vote for Labour and going back to square one. It's only by voting Conservative and sticking with the plan that you actually get rid of Labour and ensure that we have a Conservative government under this Prime Minister.
Mr Tomlinson, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much indeed.